3 former Navy SEALs pooled everything they had. Not some of it. Everything. The savings accounts, the pension payments, the disability checks, the 14 months of their own labor from before dawn to after dark. Every physical and financial resource 3 men who had given 16 years to their country still possessed after those 16 years had taken what they took, which was considerable, which was the kind of considerable that does not show up on any document, but is present in the way a man holds his coffee cup in the morning and looks at the wall and is somewhere else for a moment before he comes back. They bought an abandoned mountain lodge in Iron Ridge, Montana, and they rebuilt it from the foundation up with their own hands because they had decided, the 3 of them, that the thing they most wanted to do with whatever came after the service was build something that could help the ones who were struggling to survive the peace the way they had struggled to survive the war. Because surviving the war, it turned out, was the part they had been trained for. The peace was the part nobody prepared you for. 14 months later, a man named Raymond Holt handed a judge a piece of paper. And the judge handed Sheriff Nora Walsh an eviction notice. And Sheriff Walsh, who was a good and honest woman bound entirely by what the law showed her, drove up the mountain and handed it to Cole Harrington, who read it once and handed it to Marcus Webb, who read it and handed it to Danny Reese, who read it and set it on the table and looked at the lodge they had built and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the document had not already said with complete and devastating finality. They moved into a small cabin at the edge of what was no longer their property. The worst ice storm in 15 years arrived that night. And Ghost, that massive white German shepherd with the pale silver-gray eyes, went to the north window of the cabin and would not leave it. He had been watching something out there for 3 days. Nobody had understood what. At midnight, Cole Harrington put on his gear and followed his dog into the dark. What Ghost found in the snow that night, buried in the foundation stones of a lodge that 3 men had built with everything they had, was not what anyone expected to find. But it was exactly what they needed. And what Raymond Holt did not know was buried there is the reason this story ends the way it ends. Stay with me. Because loyalty, when it has 4 legs and silver-gray eyes, does not stop watching until it has found what it came to find. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over men who have decided something together, and it is different from all other kinds of silence in the specific way that shared decisions are different from individual ones. It has weight and direction and the particular quality of something that has been arrived at through a long process and is now simply the fact of the matter, not requiring further discussion, not available for revision, simply present in the room the way the furniture is. Present, occupying its space without apology. The silence in the truck on the drive from Billings to Iron Ridge, Montana, on a Tuesday morning in late October had exactly that quality. 3 men in a truck that was loaded beyond what trucks are designed to carry. Gear and tools and supply crates and the particular accumulated equipment of 3 people who have been living out of military-issue duffels for most of their adult lives and have only recently begun the process of acquiring the kind of possessions that imply a permanent location. And between them, the silence of people who have said everything that needed saying and have arrived at the place where saying more would be a kind of disrespect to the decision that has already been made. Cole Harrington was driving. He was 46 years old and had the build of a man who had maintained physical conditioning as a professional requirement for so long that it had become simply how his body existed in the world. Tall and broad, and without any of the softness that years of desk work produces in men who were once physical but have stopped being so. His hair was close-cropped, and carrying the silver that had been coming in at the temples since his early 40s, and had accelerated in the past 2 years in the way that certain kinds of sustained stress accelerate certain kinds of physical change. His eyes were dark green and had the quality of eyes that process information continuously, not with any visible effort, not with the performing watchfulness of a man who wants you to know he is paying attention, but with the quiet comprehensive attention of someone who has spent years in environments where missing information had permanent consequences and has never been able to fully turn that function off, even in environments that don't require it. The old shrapnel scar on his right forearm caught the flat October light when he shifted the wheel, a seam of palest skin running 4 inches along the inside of the forearm that was old enough to have lost any drama it might once have carried and had become simply one of his features, like the set of his jaw or the particular way he tilted his head when he was listening to something he needed to fully understand. In the passenger seat Marcus Webb sat with his right hand resting on the window frame, the 2 missing fingers on that hand, the index and the middle, gone from the second knuckle on both, the result of a breech charge that had gone early in a doorway in a country that did not make it into the official record of where they had been, visible against the glass in the October light in the matter-of-fact way that Marcus presented everything about himself, which was without any self-consciousness, and without any performance of having moved past it, simply as fact, the way facts present themselves when a person has had enough time and enough other things to do to have fully integrated them into the working inventory of who they are. Marcus was 44 years old and stocky and powerful in the specific way of men built more for sustained load-bearing than for speed, with short red hair that was going gray at the roots in the patches where the gray was winning, freckles across a weathered face that suggested a complexion that had never done well in the sun and had spent considerable time there anyway, and the particular kind of smile, easy and frequent and entirely genuine, that belonged to men who have decided at some fundamental level that the world contains more worth laughing at than the alternative, and who have made that decision not in ignorance of what the world also contains but in full knowledge of it. Danny Reese was in the back seat with Ghost. He was 41 years old and the youngest of the three, lean and quiet in the way of men whose intelligence runs so efficiently that it does not require much external expression. His dark brown skin and close-cropped hair, and the sharp observant eyes that Cole had always said could read a room in the time it took most people to find the door. He had almost not come. That was the truth of it, and Cole knew it, and Marcus knew it, and Danny knew it, and none of them spoke of it because the almost was behind them now, and what mattered was the fact of his being here, in the truck, on the road to Iron Ridge, which was the only version of events that any of them were interested in. He had spent 6 months after his discharge doing what the system asked of him, and then 3 months doing nothing, and then Cole had called him from a property listing in Montana that he had found at 2 in the morning, and had described to Danny in the quiet specific way that Cole described things he had already decided, and Danny had listened and said I will think about it, and had thought about it for 3 days and had called Cole back and said what time do you need me there? Ghost occupied the back seat with the focused composure of a working dog who has been in vehicles enough times to have established a preferred position, his broad white chest forward, his pale silver-gray eyes moving between the window and Danny's face in the specific monitoring circuit of a dog who is content with his immediate situation but has not switched off the function that would alert him if the situation changed. He was 94 pounds of white German shepherd with a coat that was so densely white it seemed to generate its own light in dim conditions, the specific cream white of fresh snow in certain light, and the pale white of old ivory in others. His eyes were the thing that made people stop and look, pale silver-gray, almost white themselves, the kind of eyes that in certain lights appear to be barely there at all, and in others appear to be seeing considerably more than anyone around them understood. He had been with Cole for 5 years, acquired from a military working dog retirement program when Cole's discharge had made the acquisition possible. And in those 5 years the two of them had developed between them the specific understanding that builds between a working man and a working dog when both have been through enough to have stopped being surprised by what the other is capable of and have settled into a mutual regard that is past the stage where it requires demonstration. The lodge property was listed as abandoned in the county records, which was accurate in the technical sense that no one had occupied it in 11 years and inaccurate in the sense that a property is truly abandoned only when it has ceased to be cared about. And this one had been cared about. By Cole, who had found it, and by Marcus and Danny, who had looked at the photographs Cole sent, and had understood without lengthy explanation what he was proposing and why, and by the three of them, collectively, in the months of planning that had preceded the purchase. It sat on 43 acres on the north slope of the Iron Ridge Valley, a main lodge structure of timber and stone that had been built in 1923 by a man named Theodore Marsh who had come to Montana from Vermont with a specific conviction that the mountains required a different kind of building than the places he had come from, and had built accordingly, and which had been added to and modified across the decades by various owners in ways that were sometimes sympathetic to the original structure and sometimes not, and which was in its current state a place that had the bones of something exceptional, and the surface presentation of something that had been through a great deal and had not been properly attended to for a long time, which suited the three men perfectly, because attending to things that had been through a great deal and needed someone to take them seriously was precisely what they had in mind. The plan was specific and had been arrived at through months of conversation across 3 different time zones before they had all been in the same room to finalize it. A veteran rehabilitation center. Not the institutional kind, not the kind with fluorescent lighting and group sessions in a circle, and the particular performed wellness of facilities that treat the symptoms while leaving the cause largely unaddressed. The kind that used physical work and mountain air and the specific restorative quality of a place that demanded your full attention and returned it with something that was harder to name but that all three of them had been lacking since they left the service and had recognized the absence of, which was the feeling of doing something that mattered in a context that could absorb your full capability. They had the combined expertise of 43 years of military service. They had the construction skills that military service builds in men who have operated in environments where you build what you need because nothing is provided. They had each other, which was the thing that had made it possible to conceive and the thing that would make it possible to execute. And they had Ghost, who was not part of the plan in any formal sense but who had been present at every planning conversation and who would be present at every stage of the execution. Because Ghost went where Cole went, and that was the whole of Ghost's position on the matter. They spent 14 months rebuilding the lodge. This is a sentence that contains multitudes in the way that short sentences about long periods of sustained difficult work tend to contain them. The early mornings before the light was sufficient, and the late evenings after it had gone. The physical work of tearing out what was damaged and replacing it with what was sound. The learning curve of construction techniques that military training had introduced but not perfected. The specific exhaustion of men who are working at the edge of their physical capacity every day and are sleeping hard and rising to do it again because the alternative is not finishing, and not finishing is not an option they have allocated space for in their thinking. The roof first, because the roof was what everything else depended on. The old shingles stripped and the rotted decking replaced, and new metal installed with the thoroughness of men who understood that doing it right once was the only acceptable approach. Then the foundation reinforcement, the electrical, the plumbing, the interior walls, the heating system, the kitchen, the communal spaces, the individual rooms designed with the specific knowledge of what veterans actually needed rather than what institutional thinking assumed they needed. Ghost was present for all of it. He moved through the construction site with the adaptable attentiveness of a working dog given a large operational area, ranging the perimeter in the mornings, settling near whatever area was being worked in the afternoons, conducting his evening assessment of the north property line with the methodical patience of an animal who has decided that the north property line requires regular attention and is providing it regardless of whether anyone has asked him to. Marcus noticed it first. He mentioned it to Cole on the third week, that Ghost spent a specific portion of every evening at the north boundary of the property, not ranging, not alert to anything Cole or Marcus could identify, but present there in a way that was different from his general watchfulness, a focused and patient attention directed at a specific section of the old stone foundation that predated the lodge building by several decades, the foundation of what the county records listed as an original outbuilding that had been demolished in 1947, and of which nothing remained above ground except the first 2 feet of stone wall, barely visible above the accumulated soil and overgrowth and years of mountain debris. Cole had looked and seen nothing, and had said that Ghost sometimes fixated on things that had no apparent significance, which was true, and Marcus had said that he knew but that the quality of this particular fixation seemed different from the ordinary kind, which was also true, and Cole had looked at his dog standing patient and still at the north foundation stones in the late October light, and had acknowledged that Marcus was not wrong, and had filed it in the part of his mind that held things that did not yet have enough information attached to them to be acted on, but that deserved to be remembered. The eviction notice arrived on the 41st week. Not at the completion of the work. They were 3 weeks from the finish, close enough to smell it, close enough that they had begun having specific conversations about the opening, about the first veterans they would contact, about the particular way they were going to announce what they had built and to whom, but before the completion, in the specific timing of a thing that has been designed to arrive at the moment when it will do the most damage, which this had been. Raymond Holt was 58 years old, and had been developing mountain land in this county for 22 years with the specific expertise of a man who understood that the difference between legal and ethical was not always the same difference, and who had made a professional practice of operating in the space between them. He was thin-faced and precise and wore expensive winter clothing in the way of men who have decided that quality of dress is a form of authority, and he had found in the county deed records a technical irregularity in the title transfer that had conveyed the lodge property to Cole and his partners, an irregularity that a judge had agreed, on the basis of the documentation Holt provided, was sufficient to render the transfer incomplete, and on the basis of which Holt had registered a competing claim to the property and had obtained, through a legal process that moved with the specific efficiency of legal processes that have been well funded by someone with a strong interest in the outcome, the eviction order that Sheriff Nora Walsh delivered on a Thursday morning in November, while the sky above Iron Ridge was doing what Montana skies do in November, which is prepare themselves for what is coming. Nora Walsh was a good sheriff. Cole understood this as she handed him the document. Understood it in the specific way that you understand the quality of someone who is doing something that is causing harm and knows it, and is doing it anyway because their understanding of their obligation requires it of them. The understanding of a person for whom the law is not a convenience to be applied when convenient but a framework to be respected, even when the framework produces outcomes that the person applying it would not choose if the choice were theirs. She looked at him with steady brown eyes that were not apologetic and were not cold but were simply honest about what they were doing, and she said that she was sorry for what the document said, and that if there was anything she could legally do within her authority she would do it. Cole had looked at her for a moment, and then had nodded, and taken the document, and she had driven back down the mountain road, and Cole had stood on the porch of the lodge they had built, and had held the document in both hands for a long time before he went inside. He had read it once. Then he had handed it to Marcus, who had read it, and handed it to Danny, who had read it and set it carefully on the table in the main room of the lodge they had built together, and had looked at the room around him. The ceiling they had replaced, the floor they had refinished, the walls they had insulated and finished, and painted in the specific colors they had chosen after considerable discussion, because the colors of a room matter to people who are going to spend time in that room recovering from things that had damaged their relationship with ordinary comfort, and had said nothing for a long time. Then Danny said, very quietly, that they should pack what they needed for the cabin. And nobody argued because Danny was right, and arguing with what was right had never been something any of them spent energy on. They moved into the cabin that evening with Ghost, and the ice storm arrived at 10 o'clock, and Ghost began his pacing at the north window at the specific hour when the storm was fully established, and the temperature had dropped past the point where the cold outside became something that did not wait to be noticed but announced itself through every gap in every structure it encountered. Cole watched him for 30 minutes from the chair nearest the wood stove. Marcus sat on the cot along the east wall and watched Cole watch Ghost. Danny stood at the south window looking at the storm and not looking at it simultaneously, the way people stand at windows when the window is not actually what they are looking at. None of them spoke. The pacing continued. Door to north window to door. The specific repetitive circuit of a dog delivering a message to a recipient who has not yet confirmed receipt, patient in the way that working animals are patient when they have decided to wait rather than force the issue, the patience of something that has no doubt about what it knows and is simply waiting for the slower process of human understanding to catch up. At midnight Cole stood. He did not explain himself because the three of them were past the place where explanation was required. He put on what needed to be put on and he took what needed to be taken and he opened the door and Ghost went through it without hesitation, into the ice storm, north, and the other two men followed because that is what these particular men did with each other, which is follow without requiring the reason to be stated, because the reason was Ghost and Ghost was sufficient. The ice outside was not snow. This was the distinction that mattered. Not the blizzard that produces drifts and covers terrain features under a uniform white, but the ice storm that coats everything it touches with a transparent shell that catches whatever light is available and returns it as a cold glitter, that turns every surface into a thing that is beautiful and treacherous simultaneously, that makes the ground unreliable and the branches dangerous and the granite of the mountain face above them visible in a new way. The rock catching the flashlight beam and returning it amplified, as if the mountain itself had been lit from within. The wind was not driving the ice horizontally the way blizzard wind drives snow. It was moving it at angles, finding the exposed surfaces of hands and faces and the gaps between layers with the specific efficiency of cold that has decided to be thorough. Cole moved with his head angled into it, and his weight distributed in the way of a man who has walked in serious conditions before, and understands that the ground's cooperation is not guaranteed. Ghost moved ahead through the ice with the purposeful directness of a dog following something internal, rather than anything the humans behind him could perceive, his white coat catching the flashlight beam and returning it as he moved, his pale silver-gray eyes glancing back at intervals to confirm the three men were following, and then moving forward again, north across the property boundary, and toward the section of old stone foundation that Marcus had noticed him watching for the past 3 evenings. The foundation stones were visible now in the ice-coated landscape in a way they were not in ordinary conditions. The ice had found the crevices between the old granite blocks and settled in them, and the flashlight beam caught this, making the stone structure more defined against the surrounding ground than it normally appeared. Ghost reached the foundation and stopped. He was at the northeast corner of the old stone structure. He stood with all 4 feet planted on the ice-covered ground, his broad white chest forward, his pale silver-gray eyes fixed on a specific point at the base of the foundation where 2 particularly large granite blocks met at the corner, and then he began to dig. Not the frantic digging of a dog that has scented something and is reacting with excitement, the methodical, deliberate digging of a working animal, executing a task with the focused competence of something that knows exactly what it is doing and is doing it as efficiently as possible. His paws worked at the frozen ground at the base of the cornerstones, breaking through the ice crust, finding the soil beneath, the soil hard with the cold but not impenetrable, the accumulated debris of decades, dead leaves, pine needles, the compressed organic matter that builds up at the base of old stone walls over the course of many years, coming away in the focused excavation that Ghost was conducting with the patience and the precision of an animal that has not the slightest doubt that what it is looking for is there. Cole dropped to his knees beside Ghost. The ice crust cracked under his weight and the cold came through his pants immediately, but he was not thinking about the cold. His hands went into the excavation beside Ghost's paws, the 2 of them working together in the way they had worked together in other places and other conditions, the specific coordination of a man and a working dog who have been in enough shared situations to have developed a physical language for this kind of joint effort that does not require words or signals. Simply the mutual adjustment of 2 beings doing the same thing in the same space with the same purpose. Marcus was on Cole's left within 30 seconds and Danny on his right within 10 seconds after that, and the 4 of them, 3 men and a dog, worked at the frozen base of the 1923 foundation corner in the ice storm in the dark, and the ground gave up what it was holding with the gradual reluctant quality of things that have been in one place for a very long time and do not release easily. The metal was the first thing Cole felt that was not soil or stone or root. He felt it before he saw it, the specific quality of worked metal under his fingertips, not the rough iron of a natural mineral but the smooth precise surface of something that had been made by human hands for a specific purpose and had been here long enough that the cold and the damp had found it and done what cold and damp do to metal over the course of time, which is change its surface but not its structure. He said nothing. He worked around it with both hands, feeling its dimensions, roughly rectangular, approximately the size of a document box, the corners square and deliberate, and he cleared the soil from around it and got both hands under it and lifted it, and it came free of the ground with the resistance of something that has been in one place for a long time and has reached a partial accommodation with the earth around it. It was a metal document box. Not a modern one. The construction was older than that, the kind of heavy-gauge steel fabrication that was common in the early and middle decades of the previous century, built with the assumption that the thing it protected was worth building something substantial to protect. It was locked, but the lock was frozen and the box itself had the feel of something that had been sealed against the elements by someone who understood the elements, the seams showing evidence of careful work, the kind of careful work that someone does when they intend what they are sealing to remain sealed and intact for a very long time. Ghost sat back from the excavation and watched Cole lift the box with the specific settled quality of a working animal that has completed the task it came to complete and is now in the monitoring phase, his pale silver-gray eyes on the box in Cole's hands, patient and certain and entirely unsurprised. They carried it back to the cabin. Cole set it on the table. The 3 men stood around it, and Ghost lay down on the floor near the wood stove in the position he occupied when he had determined that the work was done and the rest was for the humans, and the 3 of them looked at the box for a moment in the specific silence of people who have been through something together and have arrived at a threshold and are taking a breath before they cross it. Marcus went to the equipment shelf and found the bolt cutters and cut the frozen lock in 8 seconds with the efficiency of a man who has cut locks in conditions considerably more urgent than this, and Cole lifted the lid. The documents inside were in a state that spoke directly to the quality of the box and the care of the person who had placed them there. Not pristine, Time had found the paper despite everything and had done what time does to paper, yellowing the edges, softening the texture, making the ink in certain places faint but not illegible, but intact, readable, present in a way that things that have been properly protected tend to be present, which is completely and with the full weight of what they contain. There were 3 documents in total. The first was a survey map, hand-drawn, dated 1923, signed by a county surveyor whose name Cole did not immediately recognize, showing the boundaries of the Theodore Marsh property with a precision that suggested the kind of surveyor who took his work as seriously as the terrain required. The second was a property deed, the original deed, the 1923 transfer of the land from the county to Theodore Marsh, bearing the county seal and the signatures of 3 officials whose names were recorded in the county register of that period. And the third was a handwritten letter, 4 pages in the careful deliberate cursive of someone who wrote by hand with the understanding that what they were writing mattered and deserved the attention of handwriting done well. Cole read the letter standing at the table with a flashlight in his left hand and the pages in his right, while Marcus and Danny read the survey map and the deed beside him, and what the letter said, written by Theodore Marsh himself, dated November 1923, addressed to whoever finds this, was the thing that the fraudulent deed claim had needed to not exist, which was a clear and legally articulate description of the original property boundaries, the specific easements and encumbrances attached to the land, the chain of ownership from the county's original territorial grant forward to the 1923 transfer, and the piece that made Marcus, reading over Cole's shoulder, say something that was not a word and was not silence but lived precisely between them. A specific notation about a deed registration irregularity that Theodore Marsh had identified in 1923 and had documented here precisely because he had understood, with the foresight of a man who had dealt with enough competing land claims in his life to know how they tended to go, that the irregularity might be used against the property's future owners, and who had buried this documentation at the northeast corner of his original foundation with the explicit intention that it be found if that day ever came. Theodore Marsh had understood in 1923 what Raymond Holt had counted on no one understanding in the present, which was the exact nature of the deed irregularity and the original documentation that resolved it. Holt had built his claim on the irregularity's existence. Marsh had buried the resolution of it in the corner of his foundation, and written a letter explaining it with the patient thoroughness of a man doing the most important work of his stewardship of a place he loved. Cole sat down. He sat down at the table with the letter in his hands, and he did not speak for a long time, which was not unusual for Cole but had a different quality than his ordinary silences, the quality of a man sitting inside the full weight of something that has just shifted in a direction he had stopped allowing himself to believe it might shift. Marcus put both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling. Danny sat in the chair across from Cole and looked at the letter, and then at the survey map, and then at the deed, and then at Ghost, who was watching all of them from his position near the wood stove with those pale silver-gray eyes that held the specific quality they always held, which was complete and settled certainty, the certainty of an animal that found what it came to find, and considers the rest to be the human's business, and is confident in the human's ability to handle it from here. Cole called Sheriff Nora Walsh at 1:47 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told him that she had not been sleeping deeply, which told him something about what kind of person she was and what the eviction notice delivery had cost her. He said that he needed her at the cabin. He said that Ghost had found something in the foundation of the old outbuilding, and that what Ghost had found was going to require her professional attention. She said she would be there in 40 minutes. She was there in 32. She came through the cabin door with her auburn braid and her practical winter coat and her steady brown eyes, and she sat at the table where Cole had arranged the 3 documents, and she read them. She read them the way a person reads documents that are changing the shape of what they thought they understood. Slowly at first, then going back to the beginning and reading again, then sitting still with the documents in front of her while her mind did the work of assembling what she had read into its proper structure.